Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the nervous system and action potentials. So just to begin, we're going to start with a warm-up question. Which of the following is true about a typical neuron? A, the only organelle present is a nucleus. B, the only organelle present are mitochondria. C, the only organelle present are ribosomes. D, neurons have all of the organelles listed above. Or E, neurons do not have any organelles. So the answer to this question is D. Neurons have all of the organelles listed above. Neurons are actually nerve cells, which means that they have the organelles needed to replicate and uh, create their own energy and proteins as well. So moving on, in this video, we're going to be covering primarily vertebrate nervous systems, the central nervous system, as well as the peripheral nervous system. We will go over information processing, the components to both nervous system divisions, as well as the divisions within the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And we will mention the difference between white matter and gray matter as well. In the second portion of the video, we will go over action potential and the ion channels that are related. So the difference between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system deals with what functions they have and what components make up the nervous system. So for the central nervous system, its primary focus is to process a signal or multiple signals and allow it to essentially be integrated for a response later on. So this is just the processing portion of the nervous system. This consists of the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is used to relay the signal, a stimulus, or just the process signal to and from the central nervous system. Usually it results in some sort of movement by the organism. And the peripheral nervous system is made out of nerves and ganglia. It's important to know that the central nervous system developed from the dorsal nerve cord, while the peripheral nervous system developed from neural crest cells. If you take a look at the figure below, this is the three-step process generalized for signal processing. First, there will be some sort of sensory input, either internal or external stimuli, detected by the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system will send the signal to the central nervous system for integration by interneurons. Following this integration and processing, the central nervous system's signal that's already processed will be taken to have some sort of motor response by motor neurons. And this is dictated by the peripheral nervous system. Now, the difference between gray matter and white matter is essentially whether or not the neurons are myelinated. So gray matter are the unmyelinated axons. That is, there is no Schwann cells or myelin sheets covering regions of the axon to speed up the propagation of a signal. As a result, it takes longer for a signal to get to where it's supposed to go. So neurons that make up gray matter are usually concentrated in regions where their primary activity or the primary focus is to receive signals or do short-range information processing. However, white matter with the myelinated axons are able to send the signal faster to where it's supposed to go. So as a result, they are in regions where they would be able to where their signals speed really matters. So for example, with the brain, the white matter is concentrated inside because you need to have the fast signal propagation for the integration and processing of all the information to happen quickly. While as for the spinal cord, the white matter is located on the outside because the spinal cord would need to interact with the peripheral nervous system to receive and send out signals. So we're going to focus on the central nervous system now. The brain, which consists of the brainstem, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the cerebrum, coordinates the information processing on a more global, not global, organismal level. So for the brainstem and the other three parts of the brain, they have specific roles to carry out. Each of them can only be carried out once it receives a signal from the spinal cord. The spinal cord is basically the bridge between the brain and the peripheral nervous system. However, some signals require fast responses, and this is called reflexes. So once a signal or a stimulus occurs, the peripheral nervous system detects it and sends it directly to your spinal cord. The spinal cord would then process the information, and if there's some sort of response that has to happen quickly, let's say you put a finger near a very hot surface, the spinal cord won't send the signal to your brain, have it process the heat, and then send that signal back out to your motor neurons for you to flinch away from the hot surface. The spinal cord itself would just automatically send to the motor neurons, this surface is hot, don't touch it anymore. For the peripheral nervous system, there are several different divisions. The autonomic nervous system as well as the motor nervous system. We'll get to the differences in the following slides, but for now, there are several different nerves and neurons that you should be aware of. There's the cranial nerves, so cranial like brain. These nerves originate from your brain and end up somewhere in your upper body. Your spinal nerves, spine, they originate from your spinal cord and extend to other parts of the body that are below your head. Afferent neurons carry information towards the central nervous system. So these are the sensory neurons and sensory organs that Professor Joseph was mentioning in lecture. These neurons receive the stimuli and send it towards the central nervous system. Efferent neurons do the opposite. They send information away from the central nervous system. So like affect and effect. Similarly, affect would, the definition of affect means, with A, means that something is going to lead to a effect, right? The effect is a consequence. So efferent neurons, or effect, right, if you associate those two, will result in a effect. It will lead to the motor neurons having some kind of response. So that's one way to associate these terms. Next is within the peripheral nervous system, there's the autonomic nervous system and the motor nervous system. The autonomic nervous system are the unconscious responses that we have. So whether or not our heart beats, if we're breathing right, if we're able to digest our food, these are the activities that we do without really thinking about it. So there's further classifications. There's the sympathetic nervous system, which basically focuses on once you're under stress, whether or not you fight or you flight, you run away. The parasympathetic has to do with returning your body back to peace. You're resting and you're digesting and you're just recovering from whatever situation you're in. Enteric division of the autonomic nervous system deals with your GI tract. Essentially, it's digestion, your pancreas and gallbladder activities, all of the stuff that has to do with your internal metabolism. For the motor nervous system, it has to do with voluntary control, usually dealing with locomotion, just movement, right? So the motor nervous system sends signals from your central nervous system to your skeletal muscles, so like the muscles in your arms and your legs, and that allows you to move around and perform activities. The next portion of this video will have to do with action potential. So action potential of a cell or of a neuron has to do with a change in membrane potential or voltage or current. So essentially what's happening is that at resting, a neuron will be at negative 70 millivolts, and it will continue to remain there until some stimulus is detected. Once some stimulus is detected, some gated ion channel will open, right? Usually it's sodium. The sodium channel would open, and this would depolarize the neuron until it reaches a threshold. And this threshold, which is noted in the figure on the left by E, is at negative 55 millivolts. Once it reaches a threshold, there's this all or none response in which once it reaches that negative 55 millivolts, most of the other voltage-gated sodium channels will open, and the influx of sodium, the sodium that's coming in, will increase dramatically. So you're going to be depolarizing at a very high magnitude. Once you get to a certain level, what's happening is that there's going to be a refractory period. And during this refractory period, which is denoted in the figure by C, this refractory period has the voltage-gated potassium channels open, so potassium can leave the cell, and the inside of the cell will become more negative. But also the voltage-gated sodium channels that were open are now blocked. They're essentially closed, so no more sodium can enter the cell. By doing this, you're lowering the voltage, the cell's becoming more negative, and it's going to undershoot the resting potential at negative 70. At this point, you're going to have some hyperpolarization, denoted on the figure as D. At this point, what's happening is that the potassium channels have been open for a really long time. So what happens is that while the sodium voltage-gated channels are resetting back to its closed state, the potassium channels remain open. After a while, there's the sodium and potassium ATPase, or the sodium-potassium pump, and the potassium leak channels and sodium leak channels that essentially restore the cell back to its proper voltage, which is negative 70 millivolts. So once this action potential has occurred, what happens is that it's going to continue sending this signal all the way down to the end of the axon at the terminals. At these terminals, what's going to happen is that there's vesicles that contain neurotransmitters. Outside of the neurons, there's high calcium concentrations. So they are able to flow down their concentration gradient into the cell. The neurotransmitters, which are stored in these vesicles already, are able to release the neurotransmitters into the synapse once calcium is stimulating these vesicles. The calcium comes in from outside of the cell into the cell and interacts with the vesicles. They release the neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters are going to bind to a ligand-gated ion channel in the postsynaptic cell. So the postsynaptic cell could either be another neuron, it could be muscles, it could be other cells. And what happens is that once they enter the postsynaptic cell, the potassium channels and the sodium channels are open, and another cycle of the action potential can occur, generating the next electrical signal, which is then propagated again, and the cycle continues. So here's a question. Immediately after the voltage-gated potassium channels open, immediately after, which of the following occurs? A, membrane depolarizes. B, the membrane hyperpolarizes. C, the membrane repolarizes. D, the threshold is reached. Or E, neurotransmitters are released. Let's take a second. So the answer is actually C, membrane repolarizes. If we go back to the figure from before, at this point, the the sodium channels, the voltage-gated sodium channels are open. And when the potassium channels are open initially, what's happening is that we will have this refractory period, right? This refractory period right here. This period is called repolarization just because we're going back to the polarized region. Hyperpolarization is this undershoot right here. And the depolarization is where B is when when the sodium channels had first opened up. Okay, so the answer is C. Hopefully this clears up some of the concepts. If there are any questions, feel free to visit office hours or comment your questions below in the comment section. Thank you and have a good day.